Hey everyone, welcome to the TLC podcast. I'm Phil Martin from the University of York. I'm talking today to Jasper Roe from Durham University and Stephen Gow, who's recently sharing his time between Edinburgh Napier University and here at York. And we're going to be talking about GenAI and educational research. Jasper's the author of a book on this topic which came out last year, and Stephen's investigated the question of GenAI's utility in the research process in a paper that was published earlier this year in the journal Artificial Intelligence in Education. Stephen and I recorded an episode on the paper earlier this year, but he's back to talk about the methodology side of things and specifically the role that GenAI played. So we talk about how we should communicate to students about research in this new AI-driven age, opportunities for teachers to look into publish, struggles within the peer review system at the moment, whether humans need to stay in the loop once AI inevitably overtakes our own capabilities in doing research. We talk about ethics and many other topics. So without further delay, I bring you Jasper Roe and Stephen Gow. You've both been doing work related to AI in ed research, so I'd like to talk about that. And what I hope we can get out of the time that we have is some guidance for teachers and those in sort of teaching adjacent roles on how GenAI is changing how we conduct research. So if we have time, there's a couple of angles I'd like to cover, and one of those is one being how teachers can leverage AI in their own scholarly projects, and the other is how we talk to students about the research process. So maybe we'll start with some introductions first. Jasper, because it's your first time, if we can kick off with you. And I know you'll likely be a familiar name to many listeners already, but if you could just run us through your background and what you're working on at the moment, and a brief intro to your book on AI in ed research that came out last year.
Okay, yeah, sure. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a long-time listener of the podcast, so it's really, really nice to have the chance to join. So yeah, I'm Jasper. I'm currently at Durham University and I'm an assistant professor in Digital Pedagogies. So what that mainly means is focusing on educational technology. I wasn't always, though. I started my career as an English for academic purposes teacher in Vietnam. Actually, I did a brief stint as an instructional designer in London before that. Then over time, I moved into the language teaching management side of things. I also taught on some bachelor's degrees. And then eventually I moved from the British University of Vietnam, where I met one of my longtime co-authors, Mike Perkins, to a university in Singapore, which is James Cook University. It's an Australian university in Singapore. And I ran the English language teaching department there for about 3 years, before then moving back to Durham, where I am now, and having my entire focus being on research and teaching. So yeah, that's pretty much it in a nutshell.
So with the book that you produced last year, was it November last year that came out? I seem to remember I was at the launch of that with Samantha Curl and Sal Consali, if I'm not mangling his...
Yeah, great memory. Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what was the main thrust of what sort of direction were you hoping to steer people in with this book? It seems quite positive around the use of GenAI in the research process.
Yeah, so I think around the time it was written, there was a lot of conflicting information out there. And there's obviously, and there still is, a lot of conflicting voices and conflicting opinions. And I thought, what really is needed, or what I think is needed, is a book that sort of spells out some of the basic aspects of generative AI and explains some of mainly the risks. The first thing I wanted to focus on was the risks, and I wanted that to be kind of the largest section in the book. So if you want to use GenAI in research, here are some things that you have to be careful of. And then after that, I wanted to explain, well, look, these are the things that I think are actually potentially legitimate uses and could benefit you for research. But in all honesty, these are only things that should be considered once you've really been through the risk profile of some of the research tasks that you might use GenAI for and decided, based on a thorough evaluation and analysis, that you want to use AI for something. So that's a very long and rambling way of saying that I think I wanted to produce a very basic how-to guide for researchers in education who wanted to know, what is this all about? What can it do and what can't it do?
Great. Okay. Well, I'm definitely going to come back to a few of the points that you flag in the book and that I flagged with me as I was reading it. But just Stephen, just to jump over to you for a sec, because you were in the studio earlier this year and we were talking about AI and the sort of AI-assisted scoping review that you did with Sam Illingworth. And there was a second research question in your paper, which we didn't really get to touch on in our last conversation, but it was in what ways can GenAI be used to support the process of conducting a scoping review? So we'll link again to the article in the show notes, but if you could you just run us through the headlines on that part of the paper, and maybe also a quick explanation of scoping reviews for non-researchers, probably be a good idea as well.
Yeah, so a scoping review, well, people would probably be more familiar with systematic reviews, where you're looking at more sort of, I suppose, positivist outcomes of articles, and more in medical research and things, where you look at lots of research across a spectrum of articles and look at what the findings are. And this has multiple uses in identifying research gaps and what you might look at and what the common findings are. Scoping review is a bit of a level down from that, where you're quickly scoping out across a defined area. In this case, it was student use of generative AI and qualitative studies, so interviews with students about it, because that was what I was going to do at first with our student experiences of generative AI research project. So the first thing I wanted to do was to speak to students before we developed a survey, essentially. And the scoping review just allows you to have a look at articles similar to the area that you're doing. So there is a standard sort of literature review, but a scoping review is probably a bit more systematic without being a systematic review, if you see what I mean from that. And in doing this process, I was getting to grips with using generative AI tools myself. I had been using them in a way similar to a lot of other people were doing, playing around with them. And I thought, this is a good opportunity to try and experiment with different tools. Not really a very, wasn't really a structured experimentation, but probably more similar to what students are doing themselves. So in terms of this, so I do know some people that are really carrying out, benchmarking tools and using different processes. But what I wanted to do is do probably what a lot of to document the process, probably what a lot of students and a lot of researchers were doing, which is you're time poor, you're maybe not that technically aware about using generative AI tools. So I started off using various different tools, and at that time, ChatGPT was the main tool that people were using. And I started to use Claude. I did try some models based on my computer, but I faced issues around the power of the computer for using the models at that stage. So I settled on Claude, as it seemed to be one that was working well for me and for the purposes of doing a literature review. So in the process of doing the paper, I really came across significant issues around the ethics of what I was doing, what I was uploading to the tool. And I thought that was a really interesting aspect to write about, this reflection of these obstacles, ethical obstacles and practical obstacles, as probably the majority of people would be facing. So that was one of the focuses of the paper, in addition to finding out what the current research was saying about how students were using it. And what was interesting was it was sort of a meta, a reflexive research approach, where I was really finding similar things to what the students were finding in my own experience. And I'm sure a lot of your listeners will identify with that process.
Okay, so in the article you talked about the sort of fluidity of the restrictions of the tools at the time. And Jasper, I think you mentioned this in the book as well. You talk about sort of current limitations. And as you both said, I mean, this just moves so quickly. 1 week it can't do this, then it can. So let's assuming that, all of the capability issues are going to be solved and everything's switched to optimum levels and whatever your platform of choice can do all of the things that you want it to do in terms of how many articles it can crunch at any given time. And we'll come back to ethics in a sec, but let's just assume it's optimally efficient. Overall, Stephen, I'll just start with you on this one. Did you find that AI in the research process was generally helpful in that it allowed you to do more than you would have done otherwise? Neutral, perhaps, in the sense that you're sort of having to check everything that comes out anyway, or hindrance in the sense that you felt like you as a researcher were more removed from the process? So I'm just outlining 3 possible scenarios there. Were any of those sort of more where you were landing when you were evaluating the whole thing?
I enjoy using it, and I was having to really find that. So you mentioned about uploading papers. I actually didn't upload the papers to it because I was concerned about copyright issues, intellectual property around that. And so what I uploaded was around the abstracts, because they're freely available anyway, online, and my own notes on the papers. So I made my own spreadsheet in order to do that. Another approach could have been to upload all of the papers, and I'm aware that people might be doing that. I do know that, within Claude projects or similar approaches within ChatGPT or Copilot, there's lots of ways of doing this, but it's just this primary ethical consideration around what you're using the tool for is really important. But saying that, once I'd uploaded my notes around the papers, and this was actually backed up by research that OpenAI did about Claude's interaction with spreadsheets, found that it was one of the best tools for doing that. So that was quite interesting. That paper came out towards the end of the publication process, which backed up what I'd sort of found with my own gut feeling, because I had tried out other tools which could interact with different spreadsheets. But I really, really found that it was really useful for analyzing my own qualitative research, which is something that Jasper talks about in his book around that. But it has to be very much human led. And this is a big problem. And I've just been in preparation for the podcast reading about around the whole issue of who's leading the research when you're doing it with a generative AI tool, because you ask it a question and various tools, depending, will give you quite long-winded answers and approaches. And so I was just looking up the research around this about how it can be leading in terms of it. And one of the things is called design fixation. If the tool that you're using starts, you ask it a simple question, but it takes you in a direction. So it can be leading. And once you've read what it said, you can't really unread that. And I find that process, and this is my dad's an honorary professor at University of Edinburgh, and he's been using Claude as well. And this is something we discuss a lot, because he really, as a sort of semi-retired, because he's still writing books, he finds it incredibly interesting interacting. But this design fixation element comes in where we're both discussing, I'm really enjoying interacting in the process, but it does have that feel of working with someone else. And this is the problem for researchers and the authorship angle that people are struggling with. And I know something Jasper's talked about in his research as well, about how where does it sit in terms of, it doesn't have any accountability as the tool, but
right.
It does have this epistemic intrusiveness on your knowledge process.
Yeah, accountability. That wasn't in my list of questions, but it's a really good point. So Jasper, just back to you for a sec. With your book, you kind of go through various stages of the research process, and I think you kind of sequence the stages of a research project as we, traditionally see it in education. And you talk about its use in the literature review, coding themes, discussing results. What was your original, pre-AI, what was your approach to research? I know you touched on this in your intro, but could you just flesh out a bit more about what sort of methodologies would you have been using, and how has your approach to research changed? Is there anything that AI has really shifted for you in the way that you would conduct ed research moving forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, before AI, I was mainly doing academic integrity research. And so we were looking at things like the relationship between language proficiency and the likelihood of being accused of plagiarism, or, the effect of academic integrity training on student understanding. And generally, I was a bit of a mixed methods researcher. So I'm not a statistician. I'm really bad at stats, but I find them really interesting and I want to be good and I try. And then I was doing a lot of qualitative research too. Mainly that was different flavors of kind of thematic analysis. My actual kind of academic background is in discourse analysis. So, my like bachelor's degree was at University of Birmingham, and I was working in corpus linguistics. So corpus assisted discourse studies and English language teaching, that is where it all sort of stems from. I mean, in terms of what AI has really done for my own research, I'll have to be honest and say it hasn't done a ton. And the reason for that is that while it's been really valuable for me to experiment with, the more that I've used it and the more I've got to know about the intricacies of AI, kind of the less that I want to use it. And that's not to say that it's wrong to use it, but I feel, especially when I'm considering what role AI could play, I just don't trust it enough, to be honest with you. So yes, I could use it to start scoping out articles, but I'd like to do that myself. And like just recently, I posted about this on LinkedIn. I was quite surprised by the impact that it got, or the attention that it got, because qualitative research is not super attractive normally on social media. But I tried this coding program. It's a big, when I say coding, I mean thematic analysis, qualitative research coding, not computer coding. I tried this qualitative research program, and it had an AI coding feature where it's supposed to go through your data and, extract key important details using AI. And the results were just unusable. It was really, really surface level. It was very much just a labeling exercise. And it didn't really capture that exciting aha moment for me compared to if I analyzed some data myself. I'll just add that, of course, I didn't use sensitive data for AI coding. That's one really important thing. So I guess the thing is, I do see how AI is really useful in some areas of research. And I would focus on using it, for example, in asking about rephrasing things, maybe suggesting arguments, having that sort of editing, eye for editing, although even that has its limitations. But in terms of the actual core process, for me and my style of research and my preference, I'm finding it less useful than I thought I would. It's probably the best way of saying that.
Yeah, I can relate to that. It's been my experience with AI in so many different fields. You from its first playing around with ChatGPT a few years ago through to the various platforms that have come out, you have this sort of, you experience the tool and this explosion of sudden, like, wow, it's, your mind goes dizzy with all the possibilities. And then as you explore them, you're going like, oh, okay, that's a brick wall. And is there any, in terms of like how we talk to students, I mean, from what you've been saying so far, it sounds like it's not really changed the fundamentals that we need to know about the research process as researchers. So if we're running, let's say, either in the context of English for academic purposes or learning development or support classes for students doing dissertations and sort of, getting into the research process for the first time, has it changed the way in which we should talk to students? And I'm thinking about, like, would we be wise, for example, in these kinds of entry-level courses to start talking about platforms like Elicit and Semantic Scholar, or has that part of research education not changed that much yet? Jasper, I'll start with you, but Stephen, I'll get your thoughts on that as well.
One of the really strong points of AI, and this could be a little bit controversial, but I think in terms of research education, if there is something that you don't understand, for example, Prisma, if you're doing a systematic or scoping review, or what a meta-analysis is, asking, an AI model to explain that to you in simple terms is actually really valuable. And I've learned a lot personally just about basic things. So like one example is there's an electricity substation near my house. And I realized I have this massive gap in my knowledge of how electricity in that substation works. I probably learned it in school a long time ago. And I'm not so hot on that side of things. I'm not much of a physicist. So I asked an AI model to explain it to me in simple ways that I could understand. And I kept asking questions. And now I feel quite confident that I know how that works. So to me, that's, it's anecdotal evidence, but it's proof that it can be useful. And I think that extends to learning about research. There's a lot that you need to know, especially if you're like an EAP student, about research processes. And I think we should embrace that side of things. I think we do still need to focus on, the sort of, for want of a better word, the old way of doing things. So how to use, academic databases, how to use Google Scholar, how to use Semantic Scholar, Elicit, these types of things. I don't think we should sort of sideline that and be saying, look, just go to AI. But I think we could start to see AI as an adjunct, I don't want to say tutor, but an adjunct resource for self-study, for answering questions, as long as students are aware of the limitations that are there.
Stephen, how about you? Is the way that you would talk to your students, has that shifted at all in light of the research you've been doing?
Well, I've been doing research for 2 years, so other than the interviews with students, I haven't incorporated it into teaching. But we, with the QAA Academic Integrity group that I'm part of, we're putting together guidance around this for institutions. And it's tricky because, with my work in the past with academic integrity, I've been involved with using lots of teaching students and qualitative research, teaching students to use different tools, such as, referencing software or NVivo, something like that. And in that case, there is always the difficulty of you need to have the basics in order to use the tool correctly.
Right.
The foundational knowledge. So with referencing software, for example, if you don't know what proper referencing looks like and you use the software, it might not be correct. The same with NVivo. If you're not really sure what you're doing with the coding, what would happen with students was that you would face this problem of they're learning how to do qualitative research, and then they're trying to use quite a complex tool to help them with that. So it's the whole thing that the tool can help you and can be more efficient if you know what you're doing. If not, it can just mess up. It makes things worse. So you also see this with talking to a lot of, computer scientists with the impact of generative AI on coding, that if you've got an unexperienced coder using generative AI, they use AI to make something that's so buggy that you may have well just have written it from scratch. But the problem then is that you don't have the capability to have written it from scratch because you're learning how to do it. So this is like, I totally agree with what Jasper says. It's about, you need to have that foundational knowledge and getting, doing things in the standard way before the technology can be useful. So this makes me think about when I was running NVivo workshops and things, there was a senior researcher that came along to one of the workshops and we discussed it because they were curious to see how the software had come along, and that despite the software being available for many years, they were still doing the print it off, cut it up, have the piles of the quotes and things that they wanted to use and doing the thematic analysis in the old way. And they found that still worked for them. And they weren't going to use the software. And also another aspect of it is that even though people would be saying they're using NVivo or other analysis tools, they'd be using them in a very simplistic way because there would just be a range of different things that you could do with the software. And I think this is where generative AI is a sort of general purpose tool. This is the problem for students. It's like, there was a quote I read earlier. Well, not all uses of generative AI in research being ethically equivocal. So there is this problem about you use generative AI for research. Well, what aspect of the research would students be using it for? And Jasper's described a few of those things in what he's been saying. So when I was talking earlier about my enjoying my use of the generative AI, that was quite a specific use that I'd thought about and designed carefully, thought about the design carefully, where I did the research myself, like Jasper was saying, that I was worried about the epistemic intrusiveness of generative AI on my processes. I was wanting to do the work, but where generative AI could help me in a quite specific sense was I'd read 50 papers. How was I then identifying, I could go in my spreadsheet using generative AI and say, oh, which papers talked about this according to my notes? And it was great at identifying them, which is something. So that was where I was using it to amplify my own analysis. And for that, it was really, really useful around. So for students, I think what we've got to do for students and also for researchers is you're breaking down the different tasks of research and the ways that the tool can be used within those different tasks rather than just use generative AI.
Yeah. I mean, one of my questions was going to be how classroom practitioners looking to get into educational research can leverage AI. I mean, I think what you've both been saying kind of touches on this already, really. But I think, Jasper, in the book, especially when you're talking about literature reviews, you mentioned efficiency gains in the book as an avenue which could increase productivity, and we'd have time saving on there. I'm not sure if it sounds like what from what you're saying now, you might be a little bit more skeptical about that. I'm not sure if your views shifted since you wrote that, but and also I just wanted to say, I completely agree with what you said earlier about the AI as an explainer. So I've been working on a project recently, and I'm equally not a statistician, and had it quickly explained to me an example of Cohen's D and how to apply it, and that was fantastic. And so I can see how, as a sort of teacher researcher, this could really be helpful. Do you still see it as opening up doors for teachers who want to get into scholarship? They want to start getting publications, but you're running up against this perennial barrier of time, because teachers we know how much time is taken up with teaching and associated admin. Trying to find time for educational research projects is such a challenge. Did you see AI and the way you're talking about it in the book as sort of helping with any of these problems, or do we come back to this sort of same issue of having to check the data and sort of your enthusiasm slightly cooling around its affordances?
Yeah, so, as a former leading a management of an English teaching department and a former classroom teacher, doing the 20-25 hours a week of teaching slog, I totally understand that. And it's really challenging to find that time to do research, even though a lot of us want to be teacher practitioners. So I think in the book, I still think that, it does have the potential to increase efficiency, and does have the potential to increase efficiency around things like literature reviews, but maybe not in the way that we first thought. So, for example, if, say, I download 50 papers, right, and I have limited time to look through them, I read through the papers, and I do need to read through the papers, but reading through academic papers, especially for some people, myself included, is really, really challenging to actually understand, what are they saying? What does this mean? How does this relate to my topic? And I think it's there that AI could be helpful, because it allows you to have a conversation with this, this piece of research. So you can say, I just read this. What does this mean? How does this relate to my concepts, ABC? How does this relate to what I want to do with the literature review? Now, of course, you shouldn't take that information as wholesale, totally accurate, totally useful. But again, I think it does provide this kind of platform for you to help clarify your own thinking and progress through a task. So I think it can be really helpful in that way. I don't necessarily think that automated literature reviews are, the future. I think, yes, it could potentially cut down the time that it takes to find relevant articles, code relevant articles, but also there's something to consider, which is really the type of review you're doing and what your epistemological and ontological view is for that review. I mean, there's a big difference between a systematic review and a meta-analysis and a thematic literature review, which includes some sort of reflexive analysis. So there's no easy answers. I do think there is still the potential. So I haven't really shifted my opinion there, but I would say that it has definitely become more nuanced, to use a very AI-sounding word. I promise I don't have ChatGPT up in the background.
I was going to ask what kind of glasses you're wearing at the moment, but yeah.
Oh, yeah, no.
Topic.
So those are gone. Those are gone. I did wear the Meta AI glasses for 3 months, and I'm glad I did it at the time I did it, because after I took them off is when it appears that they're getting even more negative attention. So yeah, those are safely confined to my drawer, don't worry.
Just to mention a point about the productivity paradox, which I think is what Jasper's referring to. I refer it to in the paper. Just to have a look at the paper around that there's productivity paradox within using them, that because it enables generative AI use, you're doing something different when you're using it. And I don't think people have quite got their finger on what process of human AI interaction is going on at the moment. There is lots of research into this and observable use of AI and how researchers and students are using it. So, I certainly didn't find it was, like Jasper was saying, that efficiency gain within it, especially as you're getting your head around what you're doing. You still need that in-depth reading of articles and setting aside time to read articles, essentially. I mean, as a good starting point, having a designated time in your week, between your timetable, when you can go somewhere and get a good article and read up on it. But also the sort of positive aspect of using generative AI, of setting up a project that you want to work on it and feeding into the project your deadlines for when you want, if there's a special edition of a journal that you want to publish in, having the deadlines within there and the deadlines you want to meet, and going in there at a defined time in your working week, setting, even whether you've got research time allocated within your contract, which a lot of teachers won't do. This will probably need to be on your own time or in lunch breaks or something, of having the project set up, but then having another person within your department or another department who wants to work on a similar area, and having short meetings with them within that. And generative AI can help with that, to keep you on track and with your thinking. And in terms of, generative AI is an amalgam of all the academic integrity sort of scares that we've had over the years. And one that is very similar to is the Wikipedia moral panic that we had with Wikipedia when it first came out, where staff would say, don't use it, the information's wrong, all of these other things. But now it's like a search on generative AI, similar to going on Wikipedia, can be a good starting point for doing things. And I certainly find, if I don't know, similar to what Jasper said earlier, if I don't know about something, now I'll use it as a smart search engine as much as anything else to go in. But then I will make sure to click on the links and go to the source. So for me, very similar to Wikipedia.
So with the idea of efficiency, I think, actually, before I get onto this next bit, I think I wanted to just linger on efficiency for a little bit, because it is kind of a double-edged sword, isn't it? To use a equally LLM style cliche. So you can become more productive at stuff, and your output will grow. But there's always that, it seems to be, it's very hard to do that without there being a trade-off, in the sense of you kind of distance yourself from the research a little bit. it might seem innocuous at the time, but there's that, the idea of like just going through that pain barrier with an article that you're sitting in front of, trying to make sense of, trying to make the links to other things that you read earlier, thinking there's a link and then realizing you don't quite have a thesis and having to go back and rethink stuff. So you can kind of, AI can help with that. But I think Jasper mentioned earlier this idea of the aha moment. You dilute that a little bit, do you not? If you've utilized AI to grease the wheels a little bit and speed things along. Can either of you would you share that view, or am I sort of getting carried away a little bit?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really powerful argument. And one thing that we should consider is there's all this talk, just to get a bit critical, there's all this talk about, increasing efficiency and improving scientific output and accelerating scientific discovery. And that is valuable. We do want to accelerate. Look, if we can have like medical products and medicines quicker, then that's great. But there is also something to be said in some areas for slower scholarship. And there's even this book, right? I think it's Slow Scholarship in the Neoliberal University, is it? Where it's saying that, look, better research will come from time and thought and sustained attention rather than leaning on technology to take shortcuts or do all the legwork for you. So I think when we talk about efficiency, we do have to keep in mind that efficiency, yes, it can be good, but it's all relative to the research project, the research aims, and what you want to do. And there's no simple answer that faster research is better research or desirable. And there are many, many, many voices that we know in academia who would say, look, we need to slow down. We need to not focus on publishing so many articles. We need to take our time and produce better scholarship. And I think from what I've seen online, from posts, editors of journals, etc., and being a peer reviewer myself, the workload in that sense has just skyrocketed. There are thousands of papers being submitted, and are these all better quality? Probably not.
Yeah, I mean, that was going to be one of my questions. I don't know, time permitting, but we'll see how we go. But Stephen, I don't know, did you have any thoughts on trade-offs that you mentioned there? Or
so
Jasper's just outlined?
I recommend if you're on LinkedIn, because that seems to be where it's all at now these days. I recommend following Ben Williamson at University of Edinburgh on this, and he's been writing a lot about this, about the problem that editors are facing with research articles. So before he went away on leave, he posted something about the amount of articles that, 4 or 5 articles.
I saw that,
from an author, from certain authors, and saying, don't be spamming, editors with all these journals. You're slowing down the whole process. And he's just returned recently and found that it's the same thing. So, I mean, not to get too, Marxian on this, but if researchers are driving the use of AI for innovation, then you get more quality research. Whereas the problem is that it's more capital and resource that people are looking for, which is driving innovation and the use of generative AI, and that leans towards quantity. So, and unfortunately, there's a lot of research around research integrity in this, and the incentives for research about why research misconduct and plagiarism happens, but it's this drive for quantity of output which is incentivized. And this, I totally agree about this. I'm not the most prolific of scholars, so but trying to get the quality in the work and taking the time to do it, but then that's difficult because that hinders you in other ways around that. So I think, I don't know whether I mention it in this in a paper I'm working on around, it's not the technology the problem, but the technology within the financial context, especially in the UK right now, with universities within a shrinking sector with financial challenges that we're facing around these things. So it's not the ideal time really for the release of generative AI on the back of COVID, all of these other things. These are the challenges we're facing of adapting to it.
What changes do either of you think would be good to see in the peer review process on this. And I'm thinking, just linking this back to our, the question about the classroom practitioner, maybe someone who's got a lot of classroom experience, really valuable vantage point with which to think about useful research questions, but is up against this just tidal wave of publications that are, shall we charitably say, AI assisted. And it's very hard. It was hard enough to get your voice heard, to get that first publication out. And now it feels like it's just all of these editors are overwhelmed. Is there a sort of way that we could incentivize slowing down, or are we kind of chained to this model where the pace of your publications, if you're on a specific kind of contract within a university, the pace of publications is all consuming, and a lot of people just can't afford to go a year without having a publication in a certain journal? I don't know if I'm outlining too much of a doom and gloom here, or being a bit unfair to the process, but would either of you like to see, can you think of any ways in which we could tweak the process, be that, the way in which we evaluate academics or the way we view academic status?
Well, I think I did a sort of transparent review for one. It was one of Mike Perkins's paper. Jasper, I think you were an author on it. And
was it F1000?
And it had a transparent review process. I really liked it because it was a case of, there was a paper, somebody got in touch with me, and the review went right up alongside it. So I think that had a lot of benefits for, but then how that journey, that publication process is viewed in terms of, ref and all of these other things that people want to consider. But these might be less of concerns for people that are trying to get into research, teachers wanting to get their first paper published with these things. But I really like that process because it's transparent and traceable. And it sort of leans against people doing the quick and fast sort of review, a too, nasty review in it. It was a lot more collegiate. So that was something, the practice that's going on, that I really liked. I thought it was positive.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that process of publishing in F1000. And having both peer reviews transparent and available next to the paper, it just gives some sort of, some triangulation for the reader. Like, look, this is what I picked up as the limitations. This is what I picked up as, what was good, what needed fixing, what needed developing. So I think that is one really, really interesting aspect. But really, we face such a difficult situation because, we're not banning GenAI in research writing. If anything, and I think this is what that article was about, actually, the policies have shifted from initially like a no thank you to yes, you can have it as long as you're transparent. So the problem is that when hundreds of AI manuscripts are submitted, they could actually be operating within the rules of the journal or within the rules of submission, depending on how AI is being used. So what I mean there is that there's so much grey in terms of how do you distinguish a well-written, authentic, original article that's been polished using AI with a fabricated article that's been constructed by AI. And I think it comes back to detection and watermarking and all that. And I don't think it's there yet. So we're kind of stuck for ideas.
Yeah, because just as you were mentioning that, one of the things that I've remembered I saw recently, I don't know if you guys follow Andrew Maynard. He ran a few experiments with Claude Opus and what kind of thing it would produce with just a bare, effortless prompt. Pull me up a paper that's publishable in such and such journal. And he gave the examples. I didn't follow all his iterations, but it was the state of this at the moment. I mean, the one that he published that was supposedly first pass, just, a single sentence prompt, give me a paper that's publishable here. And all, not just all the references checked out, but it was insightful. I actually read the whole thing and it was interesting. And completely valid. And if I'd have thought it was written by a person, it would have been something that I would have bookmarked and saved. I mean, it's so just on this issue of detection. I mean, I don't think, I don't, if you guys disagree, but I don't think we're ever going to get to the stage where you can reliably tell. It's even back in 2023, I think there were articles demonstrating that we couldn't tell the difference back then, let alone with the state of technology at the moment. I mean, do either of you guys have any more thoughts on the detection issue?
I completely agree. No, I completely agree. And I think even this week, we've had the Claude talking about complying with the EU AI Act by including watermarking.
Right. Yeah.
And then there's been this news that, okay, the watermarking won't necessarily work if you're playing with and editing the text. And so, I commented this on Sam Illingworth had a really good post about it on LinkedIn. I commented saying, I think this is basically performative. I think it's complying with the AI Act by introducing something, but this something is it's just compliance. It's not workable. And I think you are right that AI detection is not going to ever be workable in any meaningful sense because text is messy and changeable. And, what's the distinction between 20% AI editing or it's just not something that I think conceptually even works.
Yeah. Stephen, you got anything to add to that?
Well, no. I think I'm up for a separate episode on that because it's a really interesting one. But this is the challenge that we face between, in the research that we did of the survey with students, thinking about students, and I think this is the same. This would stand the same for researchers as well. Is that you can trust the majority of people the majority of the time. And so we've got to maintain that trust, and generative AI has created this situation of distrust. So Jasper points out something in one of his papers about if you declare your usage of generative AI, then people are going to trust the outputs less. So people are then very well. This was referenced as you, Jasper, in another paper which I'm going to mention around this. So. That was declaration, and I think that's something that we've got to get over around transparency of usage. So you saw this recently with the with a case with the Sydney Morning Herald recently, where somebody had written a response about generative AI using generative AI in their process and hadn't declared it, and it was pulled. And I think the thing is that there's a lot of use of generative AI going on, which we're just not sure about how people are using it yet within things, and people are neutralizing their own use. So if a publication says don't use it in this way, well, people are thinking, I don't see any problem with this, and they're not going to be able to detect it. So it's this whole issue around a process of ethical maturation is what I said, which I saw in a paper in Revista de Gastão by Pinochet et al. I'll send you the link, which is it's an editorial on essentially calling for more transparency around the ways that people are using tools. And I think Sam, who Jasper just mentioned in there, is providing guidance for people about keeping your receipts, essentially. So having a transparency about that process. The problem comes up when, you don't have any evidence of how you've produced the work within that. But I think research was going that way anyway, in terms of, transparency of data sets, having your data sets available for people to have a look at, and just being open. And one last point, just in relation to the publication processes, because the publication processes are becoming so slow recently, what you're seeing is an adaptation of pre-publications. So Sam and I have done this with our recent paper. We've put a pre-publication out, and we've got responses from people. We just had a chat with somebody yesterday who was interested in it, and editors come to us and said, we'd be interested in publishing that. And so there's this sort of open peer review anyway. So I think that because of the problems that generative AI is causing for peer review, but also because of the problem of the publication process being too slow to deal with the change of generative AI, so once you've published something, it's out of date already, is that the pre-publications are coming in, and then it's more about, knowing your audience for the papers and getting feedback on it, and sort of validity through that process of the interaction of your research online. That is really useful. You saw this previously with blogs, academic blogs, which then turn into the final published paper a lot further down the line. So it is adapting, but I think transparency and traceability. So I'll send that paper over.
Cool. Yeah, I'm just going to get this last one in because I'm really interested to hear both your thoughts on this. But I'm not sure if either of you follow Sam Harris' podcast. He's a sort of philosopher, neuroscientist, and he's been talking about AI quite a lot recently. He's one of my sort of mainstays. He was speculating on sort of areas where we'll care about human authorship, and AI is kind of making us ask these questions now. And he was making the point that research, in the sense of just sort of adding to the canon of knowledge, is something that we've got no real reason to want humans to keep doing if they don't need to. And I think, Jasper, you sort of touched on this at the very end of your book in the conclusion, and this idea of humans in the loop. But if AI can find sort of, for example, cures for diseases and push boundaries in any discipline, then there's no good reason, as he argues, to keep humans doing this work. And sort of similarly, he could imagine reading an AI-generated prose if it was purely sort of instructive. I think he gave the example of the history of the world. It's got the best graphs, the clearest, most efficient language, accurate explanations, and an AI-produced tone would be something that people would read because all you need to do is sort of assimilate the knowledge. What are your thoughts, just to close us off on this, what are your thoughts on humans being out of the loop when it comes to knowledge production and dissemination? So if AI proves to be entirely self-sufficient and more accurate and efficient than any human, should we keep humans in research? Should it be a human endeavor, or how do you both think about this?
Yeah, I would love to speak on that a little bit. And I would say that when I think about my book as well, so when I talked about this, because it was about educational research and because it was limited in size, I couldn't go into a ton of depth about different forms of knowledge production and what counts as knowledge and also what counts as research. Research can be many different things. And, I did a little bit of training and teaching in anthropology. And that really opened my eyes to the different ways in which research can be conducted. So could an AI model go and do an ethnography by, living in a remote village in an isolated location and documenting what life is like there? I mean, maybe it could do a somewhat serviceable kind of copy, but it can't substitute for that real lived experience, which is something that I don't think we will ever see AI be able to replace. So I think the big question there is, one, what counts as knowledge? Are we looking at the sort of positivist, materialist view of the world and what knowledge is? Or do we need to widen that conception and think about, well, we are humans. We produce many different things and we have different ways of existing and understanding the world. And we shouldn't immediately defer to this idea that AI is this objective, realist capture machine that can reproduce all this knowledge that exists out there, without getting too, I hope I'm not starting to not make sense. But I think that is one of the things that kind of concerns me. And it also concerns me because I'm worried that in terms of what Stephen was saying about leading people on, we don't really know what these models are subtly or unknowingly or inadvertently doing. Like, there was the incident where ChatGPT just started randomly talking about goblins because of reward mechanisms going wrong.
I didn't catch that. Okay.
Oh, it just started talking about goblins all the time. And it was because of a mistake made in the post-training reward incentivization. And so, what other little minor things that are less noticeable than going on about goblins are being buried in these outputs and in these, so I don't think I think we should be very careful about handing over everything to an AI.
Yeah, can I say something on that as well? Because this was the sort of conclusion that I was leading to in thinking about this. After rereading Jasper's book yesterday, having a look through. Yeah, thinking about thinking about epistemology, ontology, these type of things. That generative AI doesn't have objectivity, because it's not in the world, but it's also not a subject. So it doesn't have this subjectivity. So in my PhD, I use Jürgen Habermas, and he talks about intersubjectivity. So I had a chat with Claude about this transparency around this type of thing, because I was thinking of this idea of ungrounded subjectivity. So through discussing this, and apparently this is a concept, it was influenced by some of the authors that I'd read, like Shoshana Zuboff, Surveillance Capitalism. So it was quite interesting in my own learning process about this. I came up with this term, ungrounded subjectivity, in the car on the way over here. And I was like, okay, is that something that I've come across? So I was actually interrogating that so I came up with the term through it is actually ungrounded ungrounded algorithmic intersubjectivity through these use of large data sets, which is what generative AI provides within there. So this is what is it a new form of knowledge? I mean, you could put it in there, but the other thing that in thinking about this is that because of that, it's just intersubjective essentially. We are the people that create the meaning. So that is the need for the human in the loop, because the generative AI doesn't have the accountability within the process. I think what Sam Harris is talking about, and I'm familiar with his work because he's quite he's a social media intellectual, isn't he? Quite famous. Has been on Joe Rogan, etc. Is really leaning into the AI hype of artificial superintelligence, artificial general intelligence. Is that where AI then must be created with some sort of link to a subjective consciousness, which is linked into the objective world around things. So it's very difficult to separate these two sort of conversations about the type of AI we have now and the AI hype, which is what the Silicon Valley types are aiming for. These are different types of conversations, which is why it's so hard to discuss these things without going off on flights of fancy around these things. So at the moment, you need the human in the loop, because the human provides the meaning. And also, the AI is working on all the data that humans will be collecting. So in terms of cancer research, which is one that's often held up, and I'll recommend a podcast around that by Tristan Harris. I don't know if there's any relation. And a researcher talking about how the generative AI gains. So, for example, on breast cancer, this is all data. The AI is using all data collected by humans, which have essentially trained, identified the cancers in that data set. And generative AI is building on that human knowledge in an amplification sort of process within that. So, but it's quite a curated. They're not just using a generative AI tool. When researchers are using it, it's human led, and they are curating tools for specific purposes. So they are creating the meaning and the output. So that's where we are now, I think.
So I don't think this is a topic. It's obviously we're not going to escape it anytime soon. But what are you guys doing in terms? Are you going to have you both got plans to write more about AI and research, particularly? Or Jasper, I know you've got wearable AI taking up most of your time, presumably now. But is this a topic that you guys have more plans to publish on yourselves?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly do. I think it's a topic that does still need a lot more work and a lot more attention. At the moment, yeah, you're right. So I've just finished that wearable AI project where I wore the Meta AI glasses for 3 months, and I've just submitted that, and it's up as a preprint. The other thing that I'm still working on, of course, is the AI assessment scale, and how to incorporate AI into assessment. But aside from those two strands, I do think wearable AI is kind of part of this conversation, actually. And I think that is where, as for better or worse, AI does become more ambient and more embedded, we are going to see more links between how new knowledge is created and how research is undertaken. For example, is having a wearable AI device on your face going to be a method of data collection? What are the ethical implications of that? Because there are many. And so I do see some links there, and I think that's probably what I'll be aiming to work on next. And if any listeners would like to chat about that or have conversations about that, please connect with me on LinkedIn and send me a DM, and we can talk about it.
Stephen, how about yourself?
Yeah, so I'll be continuing publishing from the student experiences of generative AI survey that Sam and I did with over 7,000 students, which is great. And we've got a policy and practice paper on the challenges of doing surveys and the methodological sort of drawbacks of a survey, self-reporting, etc. And yeah, so for the foreseeable, but I do hope to write something about the intersubjectivity and research process. This is something in terms of academic integrity I wrote about in my PhD, and I haven't yet published about that because of various other things coming up. So that's what I'm doing.
On that note, I will set us all free. Thank you so much for your time, guys. It's been really, really as productive and as interesting as I hoped it would be. So thank you for making the time to do this.
No, thank you. It was great to talk to you both.
Links, as always, in the show notes, and we'll be back to talk about whether or not AI is conscious.